Hello everybody, thank you for joining me for our class this evening in Leviticus. It's getting colder out there and getting rainier out there, but that's okay because now I can wear my flannel shirts again, so I'm pretty happy. Last week when we looked at Leviticus, we looked at chapters 1 through the early part of chapter 4, I believe. No, through chapter 3. We looked at the first 3 sacrifices in the sacrificial system in Leviticus. There are 5 sacrifices in total. So we've looked at already the burnt offering, which was a whole burnt offering made primarily to render the worshiper able and suitable to enter into the presence of the holy God without experiencing death, right? And number 2 was the grain offering, which was to express gratitude to God for, the material blessings that that the worshiper experienced in life, mostly in their grain harvest. And 3 was the peace offering, which was not to make peace between the worshiper and God, but instead to celebrate peace between the worshiper and God. It was a way of expressing gratitude, not for physical blessings, but more for the spiritual blessings of being forgiven of sins, having peace with God. So we come to sacrifices number 4 and 5, which is the sin offering and the guilt offering. Let's get into it. Like I said last week, we're not going to read these word for word because that will become extremely dull very quickly and hard to follow. So I am counting on everybody to have read the next few chapters of Leviticus on your own. And after this class, please read the next few chapters of Leviticus on your own time as well. So firstly, we have the sin offering. This is from the beginning of chapter 4 to about the middle point of chapter 5, I believe. And its purpose, the purpose of this sin offering is, of course, to atone for sins. But the text says specifically, if a person sins unintentionally. Unintentionally is a very important word. This appears in chapter 4, verse 2, chapter 4, verse 13, and verse 22 and verse 27, and then in the beginning of chapter 5 in verses 1 through 6. I know I said the middle of chapter 5, but it's not the middle of chapter 5. It's only until verse 26. Or verse 6. It is unintentionally. If someone sins unintentionally, and it's always unintentional. That's the only kind of sin that this sacrifice deals with. The word unintentionally, or some versions might say by mistake, is the Hebrew word shagagah. That's a very fun word to say. Shagagah, which means a mistake, something you did not mean to do. It's not premeditated. It was, you did not intend on it. You did not intend to do it. There's a big difference between someone who is committed to obeying God and simply makes mistakes and sins because they're a human being, and someone who continues on in sin because they just don't care about actually obeying God. And you can have this in context of one's lifestyle or the matter of false doctrine. And this is, since we see that the book of Leviticus lays it down, that the sacrificial system, the sacrifices for sins was for unintentional sins, meaning you didn't mean to, right? It makes it a lot easier to understand what many people who really only focus on the New Testament they get really confused by, and that is the matter of falling away, or falling from grace, or older versions call it apostasy, right? Rebellion. At what point do you fall away? At what point are you drifting away so far that you are no longer covered by the blood of Christ? Because various places in the New Testament do advocate for the teaching that happens, right? That is a thing that happens. However, when you get into when people talk about being saved by grace through faith only, then what role does obedience really play in that? And of course that makes it confusing, and if you have someone who believes that it is once saved, always saved, then what even is falling away? But here we have the principle laid out that the difference is if someone is intending to sin, intending to go on in sin. If someone is committed to obeying God and they are committed to giving it their best effort to obey God, and they're going to still make mistakes, they're going to still end up sinning because they are just a human being like you and me, then it is unintentional. They did not mean to do it. It wasn't premeditated. It wasn't because they're rebellious. It's because they're human beings. However, if someone is intending to keep on going in sin because they don't really care about obeying God and pursuing the truth, then this sacrifice is not for them. And that is pretty much what the Hebrew writer says in the book of Hebrews when he says that if we turn away now from the Christ, there remains no sacrifice for us. Whether it was in the Leviticus, the Mosaic law system, or in the covenant which we now enjoy between us and God in Christ Jesus our Lord, it seems to be the same principle. It is not for those who are intent on just going on in sin. So the point at which the falling away happens seems to be when you are confronted by your sinful behavior or sinful teachings or sinful what have you, and you say, you know, I don't really care. I'm just going to keep on doing it. That is the moment of falling away. That is the moment where you are not qualified for the sacrifice to cover you. It is for unintentional. And that's what the word unintentional means. It means that you are not intending to go on sin. This was a mistake. And you acknowledge that it was a mistake and it was a bad thing for you to do. So the procedure for making the sin offering, there's actually a few different procedures depending on who exactly is making the offering. If it is a priest making the offering, they must offer a bull a year old, and of course it's not going to be diseased or crippled or anything like that. It's a very expensive animal, right? Then if it is the whole congregation that sins, think Numbers 25, when the women of Midian tempt almost every man in Israel to worship Baal of Peor. It was the whole congregation who committed that sin. That would have been an instance where they would have to, as a whole congregation, make a sacrifice together. Now, it was a bull for the whole congregation, not 3.5 million bowls, one for each person. Why? Remember, ancient Israel is a very communal society. It was not like how the modern Western world is. We are very individualistic. However, in the ancient Near East, it was very communal. And it was very honor-shame culture. So when you cross these two things, community living and honor-shame culture, and you cross them, you get instances where the whole congregation shares in the guilt of a sin if everyone did it, and then they can make one sacrifice for the whole lot of them. I'm sure you can draw parallels between that and Isaiah 53, right? The suffering servant passage, the servant suffered and was destroyed for the sake of the whole nation, for the sake of the people. It's like the whole nation was making a sin offering and the servant was the sin offering. Anyway, moving on from that. The next person who could make the sacrifice is a leader of the people. If a leader of the people sinned unintentionally and it was brought to their attention, the guilt that was on them, then they must take a male goat, a year old, and use that as the sacrifice. However, number 4, if it is a common person who sins unintentionally and it is brought to their attention that they have guilt on them, they are to bring a female goat or a female lamb and make the sacrifice with that. So the general idea is kind of excluding the whole congregation thing, kind of. You can fit it into this principle. But the idea is the closer you work with God in His presence, the more serious a matter it is if you do something wrong. You remember in James chapter 2, he says, I would have it that not many of you would be teachers. Why? Because teachers are held up to a much higher standard before the Lord. If you are a leader of the people, a leader of the people, then you are of a higher standard, held to a higher standard than the common person. And if you are a priest, you are held up to a much higher standard than even a leader of the people. And so as you go up that not a hierarchy, but as you go closer to God's presence, it becomes a more serious thing. And the sacrifices become more expensive. So a common person, it's a female lamb or female goat, but for a leader, it's a male goat. And for a priest, it's a bull. That's way expensive. You don't just kill bulls every day. Those are way expensive. Then there's some special cases, mostly having to do with, I believe, bearing witness and bearing false witness, or touching an unclean thing and all of that. You would make a sin offering, but there were some special stipulations to those. And then we have this matter, that one could use a female lamb or goat, or 2 turtle doves, or 2 pigeons, or a portion of fine flour. And the portion was 1/10 of an ephah of flour, which is about 2 liters. It's a little more than 2 liters, but it's about 2 liters. What's with all of these options, you might ask? All of these options are really depending on how much you can afford at the time. Because imagine if you were not so well off and you couldn't afford a female lamb to make the sin offering, but you could afford 2 pigeons. You can do the 2 pigeons. What if you can't even afford 2 pigeons? Well, you could probably, in all likelihood, afford 2 liters of flour. Easy. This system of options is in place so that no one would be so poor that they could not make the sin offering. Note, one could be so poor that they could not buy 2 liters of flour, right? But if Israel is obeying God's laws about generosity, namely that they were not to glean the corners of their fields, and they were not to go over their fields twice to pick up what they happened to drop on the first pass, then getting 2 liters of flour is as simple as just putting in a day's work, picking the corner of that person's field. It wouldn't really be that difficult to get. So no one was so poor that they could not make the sin offering. If Israel obeyed God's laws about generosity. Now that leads to a systematic problem that happens later in Israel's history where they don't obey God's laws about generosity, and all of a sudden they have a bunch of poor people that cannot make atonement for their sins. Now you have the Day of Atonement. We'll get to that in the middle of Leviticus. And that, is a catch-all kind of sacrifice, but that only happens once per year. And so I guess that could lead to the discussion of who's really at fault for that. Is it the poor person's fault because they didn't make the sin offering, or is it really the person who is, ungenerous, ungenerous, ingenerous? I don't know the word. The person who is not being generous the way God said they must. Is it their fault? I don't know. Could be an interesting discussion. So after the sacrifice was brought and it was slaughtered and sectioned as it should be, the priest would sprinkle the blood 7 times on the veil of the sanctuary, because of course it's 7 times. This is the Bible we're talking about here. But when the Bible mentions sprinkling, it's really like flicking. You know how Catholic priests do? They'll take the holy water and flick it on someone. It's like that. That's really where they get that from. The priests in the Old Testament would dip their fingers in the blood and they would flick it. They would flick it 7 times on the veil. Once again, of course, it was 7 times because we're dealing with the Bible here. And then they would pour the blood on the horns of the altar. Now remember, back in Exodus, when we talked about the instructions for building the altar, we mentioned why were there horns on the altar? Horns symbolize power and authority. And so, pouring the sacrifice's blood on the horns of the altar is symbolizing, right? It's symbolizing how that sacrifice is what's the word? Averting God's destructive power from the sinner. It is causing God's destructive power to relent from the sinner. Seems like an easy enough principle to understand, right? Especially when you understand what the horns symbolize. If we don't know what the horns symbolize, then it's really confusing. Like, why are they talking about putting the blood on the horns? That's a little gross. What is going on here? But when you understand, when you have looked deep into it, it makes sense. And it makes sense what it's symbolizing, what it's trying to say, and it all just sort of, it works. It just sort of works in the logical sense. Then the fat and the inner parts of the offering were burned on the altar, like in the peace offering, that memorial portion. But the rest of it, unlike the peace offering, is taken outside of the camp and burned on like the ash heap or wherever they dispose of the ashes. So remember, in the peace offering included a portion that the priest and the worshipers would eat together, because it's, celebrating the peace between you and God. So God gets a portion, his priests get a portion, and then you get a portion, so you all eat together. It's like a little festival, having supper with God. But in the sin offering, you don't eat it, because that's not what this is about. This sin offering is about atoning for what you did wrong. So, of course, you don't get to have a portion of it. Then in chapters 5 and 6, we have the matter of the guilt offering. This goes all the way to verse 7 of chapter 6. And the purpose of the guilt offering is similar to the sin offering, except it's a little nuanced. It is to atone for an unintentional breach of faith, otherwise known as a trespass, regarding either the holy things of the Lord, that would be the holy items within the sanctuary of the tabernacle, that's found in chapter 5, verse 15, or, number 2, regarding one's neighbors, that's found in chapter 6, verse 2. When it is in regards to one's neighbors, we need to understand that the word neighbor doesn't mean just who lives next to you, and neither does it mean the one who is like you. The word neighbor is the word amayet, or amiyet, and it means another person. That's the most basic meaning of this word. It is another person, a fellow human being. And so, of course, when Jesus is questioned, by the lawyer in Luke chapter 10, what must I do to be saved? Jesus says, you know what you need to do. You need to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you need to love your neighbor as yourself. And the lawyer says, you answered very well, for that is the greatest of the commandments. But tell me, he wanted to justify himself, but tell me, who is my neighbor? See, that lawyer was thinking, I have treated every Jew that I've ever met with just the utmost of respect and kindness and generosity. I am a truly righteous person. And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the Jewish people in that parable do absolutely nothing to help the poor soul who fell in with the robbers and got beaten close to his death. And then he says, but the Samaritan helped him. So who do you think was a good neighbor to the man who fell in amongst the robbers? And the lawyer, he's embarrassed. He doesn't say the Samaritan, he just says, the one who helped him. See, a neighbor is not someone who is like you. The neighbor is someone who is around you. It's your fellow human being. So the guilt offering is, or some versions call it the trespass offering. That's what the King James Version calls it, I think. But it is for making atonement for any breaches of faith that occur regarding the holy things of the Lord in the sanctuary of the tabernacle or another person. So the sin offering is for if you sin against God, but the guilt offering is for if you sin against another person. The procedure, one must offer a ram or its weight in silver shekels as per the shekel of the sanctuary. Now, I have had people before, when I talked about the shekel of the sanctuary, bring up like a note card or some kind of printout sheet that has weights and measurements. No one knows exactly what the shekel of the sanctuary was. We know how it's broken down. It is 20 gera, and we know about how much a gera was. A gera is like 0.6 grams. It's 1/50th of an ounce. And so a shekel of the sanctuary is about 12 grams. And a shekel is a unit of weight, so it can be made up of any material. So gold, silver, copper, bronze, I don't care. It can be made of any material, but this is specifically mentioned silver. If you want to know how much that is worth, today in America, silver can be bought at 78 cents per gram, which I looked that up today. I think that's stupidly cheap. We should all be buying silver. No, don't do that. Don't buy into that. But $0.78 per gram, so 78 cents, which means that a shekel of the sanctuary of silver today would be worth about $9.36. Which doesn't actually seem like a lot at all. And if you interpret that as the unit of measurement for the 30 pieces of silver that Judas was given in exchange for Jesus' betrayal, then Judas ends up selling Jesus out for about $280. And that does not seem like a lot. That does not seem like a lot to exchange for your friend's life. $280. Are you serious? And if you're saying, well, it said 30 pieces of silver, not 30 shekels. The word for shekel means piece, like a part of something. That's why we have a lot of currencies nowadays that are parts of a larger piece of currency, like a quarter. A quarter is 1/4 of a dollar. A shekel was a piece of some other larger measurement. And we have a lot of other things. You can talk to me Sunday about that. I'll talk to you about that for hours. But back to the sacrifice. When making the sacrifice, because the guilt offering is to atone for things that you did wrong to other people, you have to make restitutions first, which means that you have to repay for any damaged property, for any of the person's animals that got killed, any bodily harm that happened to that person. You have to make restitutions, and it says with an additional fifth. So you add a fifth of whatever you cost the other person, or in the context of trespassing against the holy things of the Lord that are inside the sanctuary of the tabernacle, you would pay that to the priesthood. Again, I didn't say this before, so I can't say it again. But a lot of people say that there is not mercy found in the Old Testament, that there's no grace in the Old Testament. Are you kidding? God made it so that everybody could make the sin offering almost no matter what. And He made it so that if you ended up damaging something inside the court of the tabernacle, you wouldn't ever go inside the tabernacle. Inside the court of the tabernacle, then you're not instantly put to death, you just pay for it. That seems kind of gracious, that seems kind of merciful to me, doesn't it? Doesn't it to you? Not just being like, oh, you knocked over one of the holy cups and it broke on the ground. We have to stone you to death. Oh no. No! It's you just pay for it, and you pay an extra fifth. You make restitutions for it. But restitutions had to be made first, always. Then the priest makes atonement using the ram that he brought. And the last section of this first part of Leviticus, the first part being the one that deals with the sacrifices. The last section is from the latter part of chapter 6 all the way to the end of chapter 7. And it has to do with the priests, but it has to do with how the priests behave in regards to the offerings. And it mentions 3 different offerings: the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the sin offering. With the burnt offering, they were to make a burnt offering for themselves every morning. So if the burnt offering is for making the worshiper suitable for coming into the presence of God, I I think it's very important then that the priest makes a burnt offering for himself every morning so he can do his job, right? That's very important. Then also it says that their priestly garments were only for when they were making the burnt offering in the tabernacle complex, but when they were taking away the ashes from it, they were to put on normal clothes. So they had their priestly garments, and then they had their, I don't know what you would call it, their civilian clothes? I don't know. Also, when they every morning were to supply the altar with more wood. So the altar was to never go out. And in that regard, it's kind of like the lampstand. You remember the lampstand? They were supposed to trim the lampstand. They were supposed to add more oil to the lamps of the lampstand so that it never went out. They were supposed to do that every single morning because the lampstand symbolizes God's presence among his people of Israel. I guess you could say that the fire on the altar symbolizes, I don't know, God's willingness to forgive. You don't want that to go out, right? Don't take that as doctrine. That was just something that I postulated just now. But they were supposed to supply it with wood every morning, ensuring that it would never go out. Then, in regards to the grain offering, whenever someone brought a grain offering, the priest that offered it was to eat the portion left over after the memorial portion was burned. And this is a command. It was not a choice. If someone brought the grain offering, well, you got your carbs in for the day. Whether or not you were on a diet, you got your carbs in for the day. Hope you are exercising regularly, because I could imagine that at the harvest time, that would happen a lot. People would bring their grain offering because the grain offering was the first fruits of their harvest. Could you imagine just around the harvest time, people are bringing all the grain offerings and the priests are just like getting kind of, a little pudgy because they have to eat the portion that is left over from the memorial portion? Can you imagine a priest going, man, I cannot do this many grain offerings in one day. So he tries to get the biggest handful for the memorial portion as he can. Oh my goodness. Okay, anyway, also, in addition to how they were supposed to work with everyone's grain offerings, each priest would make a special grain offering when they were anointed to be a priest. So when they were inducted into the priesthood, which was when they were 30 years old, they made a special grain offering, but the whole thing was burned. Nobody ate any of that grain offering. Why was the whole of that grain offering burned? I would assume it has to do with symbolizing how the priest is to be fully devoted to God. That whole grain offering is fully devoted to God, just like how the priest that it is made by is to be wholly devoted to God. Then we have an intriguing one. This is one that gets a little confusing. It has to do with the sin offering. The Bible says the priest that offers the sin offering eats it in a holy place. But we already got from earlier with the sin offering that no one was supposed to eat that. It was to be taken out of the camp and burned. The leftovers were burned instead of eaten. So this one seems to be sin offerings that a priest makes on his own behalf. He is supposed to eat in a holy place a portion of his own sin offering, in contrast to sin offerings made by other people. Whatever touches it, whatever touches the sacrifice of the sin offering, whether it be clothes or vessels, they are considered holy. So if it is clothes, it needs to be washed. If it is a metal vessel, it needs to be scrubbed thoroughly. And if it is a earthen vessel, a piece of pottery, it needs to be broken because it is holy. You're not really going to get the blood off of it because you know how hard it is to scrape clean something that's like rough, right? So you had to shatter it. You had to break it. You could never use it again because that sacrifice contacting it has made it holy. But if the blood gets taken into the sanctuary, meaning, the altar was not inside the sanctuary. I think I mentioned this when we talked about it in Leviticus. The altar was not inside the sanctuary. It was at the door of the sanctuary because the worshiper has to be able to go there, and the worshiper cannot go inside the sanctuary. That's where only the priests can go there. So the sin offering made by the priests, as long as the blood doesn't go into the sanctuary, or the sacrifice doesn't go into the sanctuary, therefore the sacrifice itself has not gone in, or its blood, therefore it's not touched by God's presence per se, they could still eat it. But if the blood or the sacrifice went into the sanctuary, I don't know, maybe someone wasn't paying attention, so they pick it up and they walk it. You're not allowed to eat it anymore. Because it has gone into the sanctuary, it has gone into the holy place, into the presence of God. It has been touched with His presence, it has been made holy, you're not allowed to eat it. Again, this is contrasted with sin offerings that the common person makes, and the priest makes it on their behalf. They weren't allowed to eat those regardless, but if the sin offering is made by the priest on his own behalf, then he does eat it. Hierefore, it's interesting because the priest's sin offering becomes some sort of hybridized version between the sin offering and the peace offering. Because with a regular sin offering, nobody ate it. It was wholly burned, right? The memorial portion was burned on the altar, and then they took the remains out of the camp and they burned those. But with the peace offering, the memorial portion is burned, and then the priests and the worshipers ate the other portion together. It was a food offering. But when a priest makes a sin offering, it seems to cross the two. Maybe in your own time, you can do some thinking about that and come up with some parallels. Get a bit of meditating, mulling over what the Bible is saying here, and come up with the parallels on your own. That's what my homework for you is this week. Read the next few chapters of Leviticus and think about that matter with the priests and their sin offering being the cross between the peace offering and the sin offering. And come up with some parallels there. All right, that is it. That is all I got for this evening. Thank you for joining me again, and I hope that everyone stays safe and stays healthy. Please pray for those of our number who are sick or who are mourning loved ones who have passed on, and who are dealing with hardships in this present time. Every hardship seems to be amplified. And I don't like that, but it is the situation that we are in as a community. So please be there for each other and pray for each other. God bless you all. Have a good night.